Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Christian Morgner. I'm one of the conveners of the BSA Social Theory Group, and I would like to welcome you to this BSA event. This event is dedicated to an influential sociological thinker, Nobert Elias, and is part of a series of events that we are organizing at the moment, where we want to revisit sociological thinkers from the perspective of contemporary issues and debates. In particular, our conversations and talks will be focusing on debating established narratives of great thinkers or classics, and then to relate these debates to contemporary issues like race, social complexity, rapid social changes, etc. And we hope that these discussions will demonstrate the relevance and usefulness of sociological theory for sociology on the whole. As I mentioned in today's talk, we will focus on Nobert Elias, and I'm very pleased that for this debate, Dr. Michael Dunning is going to join us. Dr. Dunning is a lecturer at the University of Leicester, and as some of you might know, Elias was a lecturer here at the University of Leicester for quite some time. So if you know, part of his publications and writings have been collected here at the university. There were some conferences being organized in the past, and also there's an interesting sort of relational anecdote that Michael's father, Eric Dunning, some of you might know, was also here in Leicester, and he had worked together with Elias. Just to say a few words more about Michael. He has a BA and MA from Goldsmiths at the University of London and a PhD from Brunel University. He has also worked in journalism and media in the City of London for more than 15 years. So before becoming an academic, he had seen like quite a different part of the world. He's been in Leicester now for a few years at the Department of Sociology, as it was at that time, and now the School of Media and Sociology, where he is also a member of the Figurational Research Network and is currently doing research in regards of terrorism and figurational sociology, on community relations, but also on globalization and the dark web. He had recently had some books being published on civilization and informalization. He also had recently had a book published on terrorism in the UK. We're going to talk about this a little later on. So I'm very pleased that such a knowledgeable scholar is going to join us for this discussion. So Michael, thank you very much, for being here, and hopefully sharing your knowledge in terms of figurational sociology, and we can hopefully inspire an interesting debate around this particular scholar. Just for the audience, to give you a bit of a sense of the structure. So Michael and myself will have a conversation for about the next 35 to 40 minutes, so until about 1:45, and then we're going to open the floor to the audience. So in case you've got any questions for Michael, then you can either use the chat function, or you can unmute yourself and ask any questions, and we're going to close this conversation at about 2 p.m. Okay, so Michael, again, thanks so much for joining you. As I mentioned, you have recently had a book published on terrorism, which is a very contemporary and very relevant topic. So I'm wondering what has caused, in a way, that you wanted to write this book, and even more so, why using Elias or Nobert Elias for a book on terrorism? If you could explain that a bit to us.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just a slight correction. It's not been published yet. It's in the process of being published. So it's written, but it's not been published yet. So yeah, the book on terrorism really grew out of my PhD research, and the kind of genesis of this was during this period I was working as a journalist in the City of London, and I was caught up in the aftermath of the 7th of July bombings in 2005, and in this period I was looking for a kind of topic to do a PhD. It always been my intention to do a sociology PhD for many years, and so I started looking into terrorism as an area. And what I noticed was that there was kind of really very little sociology in terms of the study of terrorism, and for whatever reason. There are a few examples: Donatello Della Porta, Stephen Vertigans, who's also a figurational sociologist, and then very few others. But most of the literature came from political science and psychology. And one of the things I found was much of this literature framed terrorism in kind of essentialist terms, as kind of thing-like, as consisting of a variety of factors or things, and as being kind of static. And so in this way, it was kind of very kind of present-centered, and not really concerned with kind of longer-term social processes that might have contributed to terrorism. And obviously, these are the sorts of concerns that Elias has in terms of social relations. What kind of research on terrorism that did look at the past tended to project present-day definitions or ideas of what terrorism is onto the past, rather than looking at those kind of different kinds of designations. So what this kind of led me to kind of see was that a majority of this research on terrorism seemed to suffer from what Elias termed as a homoklausus conception of individuals in society. And so the psychological work on terrorism tended to consider the problem as emanating from within individuals, as a kind of internal mental disorder. On the other side, much of the other work from the kind of political scientists and elsewhere really saw the problem as terrorists being affected by something external to them, whether that's something such as poverty or religion or education levels and so on and so forth. And a kind of third approach was to kind of take a combination of these internal and external factors that basically caused individuals to undertake terrorism. And the way in which this kind of exemplifies Elias's conception of homoklausus is basically this idea, homoklausus idea of what Elias refers to as the basic pattern of the egocentric view of society, in which the individual ego is in the center. And he talks of a kind of a dartboard model in his book, What is Sociology? He has a diagram of this dartboard model. So you have the individual in the center, and the individual surrounded by these concentric rings, which represent different parts of society, such as family, education, economy, state, and so on and so forth. Now, for Elias, these kind of homoklausus self-images are really kind of pervasive in Western social and philosophical and political thought. And this has kind of developed over the long term, and in fact has developed in relation to civilizing processes. Now, before I go back onto my book on terrorism, Elias has this kind of opposing idea to this homoklausus conception, and it's what he referred to as homines aperti model of human societies, which means open pluralities of people who form webs of interdependence or figurations with one another. And these figurations, they integrate both vertically and horizontally. So that's both across both time and space. And so they're both relational and processual. Just an important point to make in regard to this idea of integration is this integration of interdependent people develops at the same time as disintegrative processes. And in fact, these integrative processes can contribute to disintegrative pressures. And this is in the same way that civilizing and decivilizing processes run concurrently. So if we think about the title of the session today, this is this kind of non-linearity of civilizing processes or integration and disintegrative processes. So there's a kind of spiraling of these processes, which are interdependent with one another. So this is what I kind of saw as missing from the literature on terrorism. This is an understanding of terrorism in these processual terms, and how terrorism can be understood in the context of these kinds of long-term relational dynamics. So what was central to my approach was to explore the sociogenesis of terrorism in Britain as part of these changing figurational dynamics over the past 250 years. And kind of key to that was the relationship between established and outsider groups, and how these relationships contributed to the conditions under which individuals were designated as terrorists, but also, and kind of crucially, act according to these time and space specific designations.
So, Michael, may I ask a question in this context?
Yeah.
So how would you say has the application of Elias, or how is that in a way reformulating or enabling us to see the notion of terrorism in a different light?
Well, I think centrally it's seen kind of processually and relationally. So one of the things that I found was that if you look at past designations of terrorism, you, for example, get groups that are kind of designated by elite groups, these outsider groups are designated by established groups as terrorists. And these include political reformers such as Chartists, some of the groups you would expect to be designated as such, the groups called the Fenians in Ireland in the 19th century, trades unionists, and so on. What kind of differs in this respect from kind of the standard approaches to research on terrorism is what I mentioned at the beginning, and that's this idea of terrorism being thing-like, and this kind of essentialist understanding of terrorism, which is projected onto the past. So most research in terms of terrorism in the past looks at perhaps the Fenians, but wouldn't look at the Chartists or wouldn't look at trades unions, despite those groups being designated as terrorists in that particular, in the context of those particular figurational dynamics in the 19th century.
Michael, it's a question in this context. I mean, very often, you mentioned you're coming to the subject from the media, and often, in the media, terrorism or terrorists in particular are portrayed as, highly irrational individuals, sick people, people there's something wrong with their mind. But then, on the other hand, what we learn from Elias is that there is a drive towards higher rationality, because can you control your behavior, you can control your habit, you've got in a way greater authority about what you're able and capable to do. So how is that notion about civilization that seems to gain actually greater control about people's own capabilities, how is that how can this be contrasted to that portrayal in the media as terrorism as something that is highly irrational, as something that doesn't seem to fit that particular model?
I think media conceptions of terrorism are kind of really very much based on this kind of homo clausus notion of the individual. It's something relating to their own morality or something wrong with them internally, a mental illness or so on and so forth. If we look at it in terms of civilizing processes, well, if we think about the 9/11 bombers or other bombers, I mean, a lot of what they do, and you mentioned the term control, a lot of what they do requires a high degree of control, self-control. So we can see how these groups have developed particular self-restraints relating to kind of broader social constraints as part of civilizing processes, and are able to undertake the kind of complex attacks. You use the term rationality. I'm not sure that's the best term, but complex attacks like 9/11 or the attacks on the London Underground, and required a high degree of self-control as well in order to do that.
Yeah. So in a sense, then self-control does not necessarily translate automatically into some sort of higher morality or higher rationality. So it seems that they're quite decoupled to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean it relates to broader social changes, kind of in terms of social constraints, and this is a much broader issue in terms of civilizing processes over the longer term. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, you mentioned the term homoclaustus quite a few times, and I thought in order to shed a bit more light on Elias, that we also want to look a bit at the development of his thinking and of his approach. And I know that this particular conception is something that he was very critical about.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe for the next few minutes we could explore a bit how this conception, how this idea in a way came about. And I know that in a way, this discovery, I mean, he didn't have the term homoclaustus back at that time, but this is something that he already in a way started to understand while he was a student of medicine and philosophy in the 1920s. Yeah, so he wasn't actually trained as a sociologist, but studied medicine and philosophy, and even he did that was dissecting people as part of those studies.
Yeah.
So I wondered, could you tell us a bit more about the intellectual context in the 1920s, and in a way, how he discovered that notion of the homoclaustus, or that idea back in those days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as you kind of alluded to there, Elias's approach is something to be seen as something that develops. It's kind of developmental, and he builds upon predominantly Marx, Weber, and Freud, but a number of others. And this kind of battle in terms of to get away from these kind of homoclaustus conceptions is kind of really key. And this is part of Elias's break, or the break that he sees that sociology should have from the constraints of philosophy. And as you mentioned, he undertook at the University of Breslau medicine and philosophy, and this his experiences in kind of dissecting people allowed him, or contributed to him questioning this kind of idea of a kind of eternal inner world, in a mind that's kind of separate, sharply demarcated from the kind of outside objective world. And now he eventually dropped the medicine part of his studies, but ended up having a row with his supervisor, Richard Honingsveld, because Elias was rejecting the kind of the neo-Kantian ideas that Honingsveld held, and that's this idea that kind of knowledge is something intrinsic to the mind. For Elias, knowledge is something that's developed across generations as part of a process. And again, if we think about this kind of non-linearity of that process, knowledge with what Elias referred to as a high degree of reality congruence can develop, but also at the same time, you get the development of knowledge that has a higher fantasy content, and there's a kind of I mentioned this kind of spiral process, and that's something that Elias kind of saw in the way of knowledge developing. So it's always a balance between knowledge with a higher fantasy content and knowledge with a higher degree of reality congruence.
So Michael, this. So in a way, Elias was concerned that sociology shouldn't be mixed up with philosophy. So sociology should have a certain autonomy. So there should be a certain notion of independence. So it seems that was something that was really important to him. So I kind of wondered, when you think about this idea about the autonomy of sociology, and again, you put it back into the historical context. I mean, I can sort of, immediately sense that this was something that might have been quite challenging to him, in particular. So if we move on, in terms of time, into the 1930s, where, the autonomy of sociology, the autonomy sort of, of the free thinkers, etc., was something that was under threat, in particular, sort of, within the political context where he lived. So I wondered, so if you can tell us a bit more about how he, reacted to those political changes, let's say, on the one hand, but then also in a way like how he sort of, tried to further develop this notion of the autonomy of sociology, maybe sort of, within the context of the disappearing, first generation of sociological thinkers like, Weber and Durkheim and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of Elias's rejection of philosophy, he was rejecting what he called process reduction. And so his focus is very much on social processes. And again, this is the same point I made about homo clausus versus homines aperti. But there's another kind of degree of relative autonomy that Elias was seeking for sociology, and this is kind of seen in the early 1930s. And what Elias observed in this period, this kind of split, this political split, and then this is kind of the climate in Germany between kind of leftist working class groups and a kind of who mainly who were opposed to a kind of largely middle class bloc, who were really kind of opposed to the Social Democratic Party, and there was a kind of increase in violence, and what Elias referred to as a breakdown in the state monopoly of violence. Now, Elias saw that each of these sides basically were highly ideological, and he sees these ideologies as illusions. And for Elias, he wanted to adopt a more realistic approach, what he refers to as a more realistic approach. And this is kind of exemplified by an interview that Elias gave later on in his life. So he was asked about a Hitler rally that he attended in the 1930s, and he was asked, why did you, as a Jew, attend the rally? And he said he wanted to orientate himself and to understand how things are connected in a very practical sense. And he said, without this kind of understanding, the kind of understanding he was trying to develop, that people act wrongly because they're guided by unrealistic ideas. And those ideas include the kind of ideologies associated with National Socialism or nationalism or communism, capitalism, liberalism, socialism, and so on and so forth. And what Elias says is that these, what he refers to as these great isms, they kind of fail to live up to their claims. And they're based on ideologies, they're based on wishes and fantasies, and this kind of, and what he says is an unrealistic picture of human social relations. And so Elias was seeking to develop a sociology that was autonomous or relatively autonomous from the kinds of extra scientific concerns associated with these and other ideologies, that the political concerns, the wishes and the fantasies that these groups wished the world would be like.
And Micah, so developing this program, I mean, to what extent was he able or unable to implement that? I mean, I suppose he, as a Jew, so as you mentioned, he wasn't able to get a professorship in sociology in Germany. So to what extent, so was he able to put that into place, to put that program into action, or was that sort of part of the non-linearity that you mentioned early on, that he also had to cope with these interruptions in his own life?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So Elias kind of fled Germany in the early 1930s, first to Paris, and then to London. And he spent a bit of time in London. This is where he wrote on the process of civilization. but his time in Paris, he did a bit of academic work, but he was mainly working. He went into business with two others, making and selling toys. In his time in the United Kingdom during the war, he was interred in the Isle of Man as a German. But then in 1954, he eventually got his first full-time lectureship at the University of Leicester, or what was then University College Leicester. He was 57, so his career was very much interrupted by the war. But one of the problems he had wasn't just these kind of interruptions to his career. One of the problems is that his approach to sociology went against the kind of dominant fashions of the day throughout his time, and so he was often kind of battling against other sociologists at the University of Leicester and elsewhere in terms of his approach, which focused on long-term social processes. Most sociology at that time didn't. And Elias criticizes this as a retreat to the present. So you have the fragmentation of his career, plus Elias beating the drum for an approach to sociology that just wasn't accepted in the mainstream, and in many respects is still struggling to do so even today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, Michael, you mentioned, so his first post was here in Leicester, and also during his time in the UK, he managed to finish his book on the process of civilization. And I suppose most people that might have joined today's debate, they already know this particular book or heard about it. So something sort of has become a bit of a common trope within sociology. So I thought, I wondered maybe sort of we could focus on a slightly different subject that was equally important to Elias, but also sort of nicely brings about how his approach to sociology, his thinking, etc. And the project I have in mind is related to his time in Leicester and the study on the established outsiders, which was something in a way that, interestingly, was not just an intellectual project, but was really also inspired by his life in Leicester, in the city. So I kind of wondered, because of that important connection and, like your role here at Leicester, if you could tell us a bit more about this particular study, how it came about, why this is also something that is really important to Elias's work, and sort of in a way, like, nicely expresses, some of the notions that we discussed earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a couple of points to start with. And I mentioned, looking at Elias's work developmentally. So the establishing the outsiders can be seen as part of that development, and it relates very much to a lot of the themes that he raises on the process of civilization. The second initial point is that it's really a kind of joint intellectual project with Elias and John Scottson, who was Elias's MA supervisee. And the way this kind of works, and the book really came out of Scottson's MA research, and what they were looking at. Initially, Scottson was drawn to the area because of the high delinquency levels, but what the research kind of turned to was the dynamics of intergroup relations between two working class groups in the area. And what they found was this kind of set of figurational dynamics that you would normally find in conflict-ridden struggles between nations, ethnic groups, and social classes. And quite interestingly, I mean, these two working class groups, they kind of differed very little from one another in terms of their employment, their education, their wealth, their income, and so on. But the established group was clearly dominant over the outsider group. Now, the main difference between them was that the established group had family ties to the area that could be traced back a few generations, whereas the outsiders were relative newcomers. And so Elias and Scottson sought to try and really understand how this set of relational dynamics came about? How did they come to be? What were the social processes that allowed the established to dominate and denigrate the subordinate outsider group? And what they were able to show, and this is kind of really fits into Elias's conception of power, was that the power chances, and it's important to use the word power chances, the established allowed them to monopolize the main kind of positions in terms of local associations and so on and so forth. But their ability to do this was related to the cohesiveness of the group and the consistency of their norms. So the established group were much more cohesive just because they'd been there for longer. They had a more consistent set of norms. One of the things that the established were able to do to maintain this sense of superiority was the use of gossip, and so they analysed or kind of examined the kind of gossip in the area. This allowed them to maintain their kind of group cohesion, but also to stigmatise the outsiders with the threat of what they called stigmatise them with blame gossip. They could also threaten their own members with blame gossip in order to keep their own members in line. Now,
Michael, how do they do that? Sort of, you mentioned sort of, they looked at gossip and they analyzed gossip. So, and in the process of civilization, he looks at historical documents, whereas this study looks at the process from a more contemporary perspective. So I wondered, in very practical terms, I mean, how did they do it? Was it more like as we would call it nowadays, like ethnographic project?
Exactly. Yeah, it was an ethnographic project, and Scottson did the majority of the interviews. Elias did some of them. They did use some kind of documentary sources, newspapers, and public records, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it was really an ethnographic piece of research.
And this sort of more contemporary sort of ethnographic piece. I mean, I wondered how does it go together sort of with his sort of criticism of sociology as it's returning to the present. I mean, isn't that something that also applies to this study, or to what extent is the process dimension something that was also relevant in order to understand the established outsiders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it does kind of differ to a lot of kind of research that Elias did. He used documents to develop time series data over the kind of very long term. But as I said, I mean, this is needs to be seen in the context of that research as well. So it does relate very much to on the process of civilization.
Yes.
The idea of a dominant group referring to itself as somehow better, this idea of praise gossip in the established and the outsiders, actually is a theme that comes up right at the beginning on the process of civilization, and that's the native concept of civilization that Elias examines in the first part of On the Process of Civilization. This is he refers to it, civilization as the self-consciousness of the West. So you can see these themes are kind of developing. So it has to be understood as this kind of developmental approach. So, but it does differ in terms of some of the methods that Elias usually used.
So, Michael, I wonder if, I mean, there are, we mightn't have the time to discuss those, but Elias also spent some time in Ghana as a sociologist and professor over there. And he, he wrote a paper also on what is called like African arts, based on an exhibition that he organized and or he was involved in Leicester. So again, we find there is quite a different material, right? First we see the historical documents, we see the more ethnographic stuff, and then, for instance, with the research on the African art, we see, he's using art objects in a way to apply that. So, when I look sort of, at the breadth of material and the variety of topics, it makes me to a certain extent wonder to what extent it makes sense to, use this broad label of Elias as a process sociologist. Maybe sort of, it applies only to a certain extent of his work, and therefore, you know, we're clouding to a certain extent these other really interesting studies. So I think my question here is, to what extent do you feel it is appropriate to use this label for the entirety of his work, or should we be more careful when we think about Elias and sort of, you know, talking about his approach to sociology?
I think process is central.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, he's a process sociologist or a figurational sociologist, and if you know, the work on the established and the outsiders is part of, you know, his work in terms of processes. You know, his work is a process. You know, you mentioned the kind of African art aspect. I mean, it's something that Elias collected, and he was able to compare what he saw as African art that was done by skilled craftspeople, compared to some of the art that was basically made for tourists and made in factories. But these differences allowed Elias to show developmental processes, changes. Not when I use the word developmental, I don't mean that in its kind of normative sense in terms of process. We're talking about change, about social processes. So the you know, the label of process is kind of applicable to everything that Elias did.
Mm-hmm. Michael, in this study on the established outsider, you mentioned these interesting dynamics about sort of, you know, two different groups and the role of power, and sort of, you know, how one group gains authority over the other, and sort of, you know, while you were describing this, it made me think about, you know, something that is potentially more recent, namely the Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously also, you know, is very much about there's a certain group of, you know, more established papers, sort of, you know, the potentially white British population, and there's another group sort of, you know, that seems to be excluded, or sort of, you know, seems not to have this kind of authority. So I kind of wondered, I mean, what would you think, sort of, you know, what would Elias sort of, you know, have to say, or what would the book sort of, you know, on established outsiders be able to teach us, or sort of, you know, gain us insight about such, you know, very recent developments?
Yeah, I mean, I think Black Lives Matter is a really interesting and pertinent example of these established outsider figurations that Elias and Scotsman were talking about. You know, and it's something that kind of really develops in the United States, of course, but is applicable to the UK and other places. But what I think you find with Black Lives Matter, and if we take the United States as an example, is you have a very very significant power gradient between white people and black people, an established outsider figuration. And what it appears is that the Black Lives Matter movement is an example of what Elias referred to as functional democratization. And basically, over time, over the very long term, from the period of slavery in the United States, there has been a relatively slight evening up of power chances for a whole range of different reasons relating to various changes in figurations. And what this seems to have done in the 1950s and 1960s in particular, with the civil rights movement, it's allowed black people in the United States to challenge these established outsider relations much more effectively than they ever were able to before. And I think it's probably fair enough to suggest that the Black Lives Matter movement is another example of that. It's a kind of civilizing spurt, an emancipatory spurt, much like that happened in the 1950s and 1960s. So you have black people kind of much more openly and much more clearly fighting against the kind of stigmatization and negative we images and racism and other aspects of racial power imbalances that they've been subject to, but they're being more successful at doing that, and it's much more prominent.
Michael, thanks so much. I'm looking sort of, you know, at the at the clock, and so and unfortunately our time for our internal conversation is up. So therefore I'm inviting members of the audience, if you've got any questions, you can either use the chat function. If you prefer to use the chat function, I'm more than happy to read out any messages for Michael, to keep eyesight on that, or if you prefer to ask your questions. But as I said earlier on, please keep in mind we record these conversations. So if you unmute yourself or use the video function, you agree that we can use your image. Okay, so are there any questions from members of the audience for Michael? Larry, I can see your hand is up. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Oh, thank you. Thanks. So, Michael, thanks very much for that conversation. Michael, I just want to take you back to what you were saying earlier in your discussion about terrorism or mass violence, and you mentioned that, of course, terrorism or mass violence can appear rational, perhaps in a limited sense of the term means-end relationship. And it requires planning, forethought, anticipation of consequences of actions, and so on. And if you think about the dialogue between Bauman and Elias that sadly never happened, surely Bauman's point was that it's precisely key features of the civilizing process, like forethought, planning, anticipating consequences of actions, restraint, that make mass violence possible. And I just wonder whether there's actually this is much more of a criticism of Elias's concept of the civilizing process, that violence is not necessarily something that arises from untamed instincts, repressed instincts, because there is, of course, this Freudian theme in Elias that he sees this balance of civilization and instincts in a more historical way than Freud, but still, still the idea is there. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think first of all, I think Bauman misread Elias's conception of civilizing processes. So Elias doesn't deny, these processes of bureaucratization contributing, to the Holocaust, for example. I think what's kind of central for Elias and other kind of figurational sociologists is this idea of this kind of non-linearity of civilizing processes. So they always run concurrently with decivilizing pressures or decivilizing processes. I mean, the concept of decivilizing processes is a bit more problematic, but they always run concurrently. So there's always a kind of spiraling process, this kind of non-linearity of civilizing and decivilizing processes. And what Elias suggests is, if you do have these kind of, on the one hand, a very kind of self-controlled way of administering a bureaucracy, for the final solution, for example, if you take Eichmann. But at the other side, at the same time, there is this kind of barbarization process, and another kind of critique of of Bauman is actually some of the violence in the Holocaust was also kind of very much kind of face to face. It wasn't all part of this kind of the use of gas chambers and so on. So, but the key is this idea of civilizing and decivilizing processes running concurrently. And for Elias, there was a kind of breakdown in civilization where decivilizing pressures, not just in Germany, but across Europe, in many respects gained the ascendancy. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't take up any more time. Yeah, but thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Tim, I can see you've got a raised hand. Would you like to go next?
Yeah, I was really just following on from the discussion we were just having, and it always makes me think about a thing that I've always wondered about Elias's arguments, that the relationship between lengthening interdependencies and ideas of restraint.
Yeah.
Because it always struck me these are very context dependent. That if you take something like money, the money that I use to buy clothes from a sweatshop or wherever I get my ethical food or not, you know, these are very lengthy interdependency networks, but they don't necessarily occasion restraint in some way. And I was thinking the same thing about this talk, because like other talks like this, although the internet allows us to tap into a lot of networks very easily, instead of sitting, you know, upright round a table in a seminar room, I've got to confess to you, I'm doing the washing up. I've been taking some clothes out of the washing machine from my partner and doing various other things, which actually is a sort of loosening of restraint relating to lengthening interdependency networks. So I wondered if Michael, you had any thoughts on that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably an example of informalization. So it's a continuation of civilizing processes where actually, you know, if you thinking of your example of doing the washing up and so on and so forth, and concentrating on our session today involves a kind of potentially quite a complex psychical operation in terms of self-steering processes. So there is a kind of with informalization processes, a kind of relaxation in some respects of kind of formal civilizing constraints, but actually in terms of the psychical process, it's a bit more taxing, and you know, this is the
I mean, I follow that and sort of Kazuta's argument, but I suppose I've also always wondered whether the informalization is necessarily a sophistication of restraint, or whether actually it's just a loosening. So I suppose my question is hinging around that, really.
I think it's both. It is a sophistication because if you consider the forms of restraint, which become kind of a second nature, really, become part of our habitus over time. So you don't need those kind of external constraints. So you know, if you think about you know, swimwear on a beach, and you know, you can see how this has changed over time. You know, people behave for the most part in a almost a kind of unconsciously restrained way when they go to the beach. Not everybody, you know, there are a few people who don't. But those external constraints in terms of you have to wear a particular kind of swimwear at the beach have kind of loosened. So I think there's a degree of sophistication on the one hand, but that goes hand in hand with a loosening.
No, I'm thinking in a very Homo Clausus way. Maybe it's just me, because I was not long ago in the sea wearing the most ridiculous balaclava. Anyhow, thanks for that discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay.
Thank you. Richard, I believe you had your hand up.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Michael. Anyway, hello.
Hi, Richard.
Just return you to what you were saying about the ego-centered, this Homo Clausus model, all of this and so on. I mean, it did strike me that when you start talking like that, and I've had this experience many times expounding Elias, that people will say, well, you know, there's nothing remarkable about this statement, you know, about the ego and the hyper-individualism of Western people and all this, and we think that everything goes around ourselves and all that. And indeed, Elias was riding a kind of a wave here in the 20s, and there were many people, I mean, followers of Heidegger particularly, other existentialists, many people were raising this question about the knowing subject and all that. Many. And there are, I mean, the things that I've written on this, I've found passages in Carl Löwit and places like who are very close to homines aperti. I mean, and that leap from thinking individualistically to thinking collectively, which is a leap of the imagination, was already made by these philosophers. But then, so therefore, this laid, in many ways, later people following Elias, with, like Bauman was mentioned earlier, with this idea that, well, come on then, there's nothing new. Where's the new idea, Norbert? This is all platitudinous, which is what Bauman said. This is all said before by existentialists, phenomenologists. What have you got that's new? What's new? And it did strike me listening to what you were saying, and it seems strikes me listening to, it's crystal clear what the difference is. That Elias was making a move to a sociological comprehension of issues that other people nibbled at in a philosophical or artistic way. And I think that is something that you was the way you put it. I think you could possibly have just been a little bit more gung ho for sociology here. Okay, you philosophers, you did raise this issue about the knowing subject and all that, but you did so in a way where you can't solve the problem. You've got to shift away from the way you were talking about it sociologically. I don't know whether that ramble makes much sense, but it just struck me listening to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard.
Well, yeah. I don't want to hog this either, but one more thing.
Yeah.
The established outsiders discussion that you had with Christianity, that was splendid. Yes, I love that. It's interesting, a great book. The thing is about it too is that Elias and Scottson didn't talk about in-groups and out-groups, for example, which came out of American sociology. You have to say, well, why did they call these groups established and outsiders? In many ways, it didn't make sense. If you were in the mainstream of sociology, you would use in-group and out-group, where everyone was. So Elias again would have been attacked here for being platitudinous. We all know about this, But the thing is that these words were in currency in the 50s and the 60s. There was a book called The Outsider by Colin Wilson. There was the Establishment Club in London, and this idea of the established and the outsiders were in some kind of conflictual relationship was built into the society in which Elias and Scottson were working. So to put the point I'm making in a rather elevated way. In Elias, the concepts he uses arise out of the reality that he's talking about. That's what he doesn't impose categories on it. They emerge. Many so the notion of the good society, for example, came out of one of the Manners books. Anyway, that's enough. Otherwise, I shall go on and on and on. Yes, very stimulating.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I'll leave any comments about Bauman for later.
Okay. Cheers.
Michael, we've got a few questions that have come up in the chat.
Okay.
If it's okay for you, so let me focus on some of them.
Yeah.
So we had a question from Richanda Power. She thanks you, for a very clear explanation of figuration sociology. There are quite a few questions she's asking, and I hope it's okay when I look at my clock if I just pick one of those. So she asks maybe something interesting for the audience also to know about yourself, Michael. Do you have any favorite books by Elias?
Good question. That's a really good question, actually. The one I've probably read the most is The Established and the Outsiders, followed by On the Process of Civilization. But I think I like all of them, really. There's always new stuff when I read it. And there's always new ways of seeing stuff. And the way Elias writes is just so packed with different ways of looking at the same problem. So I'm constantly finding new stuff, and I find it very, very stimulating whenever I pick up some of Elias's work. So yeah, I don't think I've got a favourite, but maybe this.
Okay, Micah. So I think, so, let me see. So, we've got there's a bit of discussion going on here. So another question is from Alex. Do we need a more dynamic concept of expanding and contracting figurations and their overlap to account, for instance, for the so-called lone wolf terrorism?
And more dynamic than expand. Sorry, say that again. A more dynamic.
Do we need a more dynamic concept of expanding and contracting figurations and their overlap to account, for instance, for the so-called lone wolf in terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of expanding and contracting figurations, yeah, I'm not sure that's the right way to conceptualize them. I think they're changing, and people over the very long term are becoming more interdependent. There's a greater degree of interdependence. If we look at this in terms of humanity as a whole, people were relatively, or in some respects, almost totally independent in terms of their social groups. There is an expansion of these figurations. They can contract, they can disintegrate to an extent. Elias uses the example of feudalization on the process of civilization. And the point about lone wolf terrorism, I mean, how that relates to this problem, is that the suggestion, or?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, Alex, I don't know. Would you like to unmute yourself? So, trying to explain your question.
Yes, I'll try and explain that. What I'm thinking about is to see figurations in plural terms.
Yeah,
it's okay to say universally there's a process to greater human integration. I mean, that's okay. We can accept some of that. But there's all sorts of other countervailing dynamics going on.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of so-called lone wolf, I don't imagine, for instance, they are completely separate and from everything else that's going on, are caught in the overlap between plural figurations. We might begin to think about. I don't know, Michael, just when you were talking, it was getting me to think then about some of the recent cases of terrorism that aren't, for instance, like organised in the kind of military style of the provisional IRA, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not organised in terms of those groups, but there's a degree of organisation, I think, and you can see this within the context of these figurations. For example, people talk about online radicalisation and so on and so forth, and particularly with respect to kind of lone wolf terrorists. So there's a degree of organisation, but it's not as formal in terms of the kind of organisations associated with groups like the IRA and so on. But I suspect there is the elements of informality relating to lone wolf terrorisms who are kind of so-called self-radicalized. I mean, it's a fairly silly concept, but I think there are probably still similarities in terms of those relationships relating to the kinds of relationships that groups like the IRA had. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm not. I don't like the idea of lone wolf terrorists because I don't think it really works. It's kind of very much this kind of Homo Clausus idea that someone suddenly just gets up and on their own and does some terrorism. I mean, this comes about as part of a range of social processes and their relationships to other people.
Michael, we are now just past 2 o'clock, so I see a lot of people are leaving. We've got one more question in the chat. So, would you like to answer that final question, Michael? Are you okay with that?
Yeah. Sorry. What?
Okay. So the last question is from Jack. I'm trying to briefly summarize it. So Jack has a question about Elias within the context of international relations, and in particular the essay called Humana Conditio. And he wondered, Michael, this book, to what extent do you think this, book is something that can be used again, so, within the context of terrorism? And the question here is, to what extent is domestic terrorism related to a decivilization of international relations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The extent to which, so I don't think it's necessarily related to decivilizing of international relations, but I think on the one hand, the concept of domestic terrorism is problematic, and it falls foul of the point I made earlier on about this essentialist understanding of terrorism. That said, if you think about groups such as those at the moment in the United States, how that relates to kind of international relations is that I think there is a degree kind of global interdependencies. There is a degree of defunctionalization of certain groups. For example, those groups that support Trump and have been designated as terrorists. These groups, for whatever reason, have feel a loss of status, a kind of a fear for a loss of status, and so on and so forth. And I think that is certainly related to a range of global interdependencies. So I think there are certainly connections between so-called domestic terrorism and broader global social processes in that sense.
Okay, Micah, thanks very much. Again, so I have to sort of monitor a bit our time. Thanks so much, for answering all of our questions. It's been a real pleasure to have you here and in this conversation. For those of you who are still here, I just would like to make you aware that we have got another talk coming up in early February. So this time we have two speakers that will debate the social thinker Theodor Adorno, with a particular focus on some of his writings on right-wing capitalism and extremism. The website, as far as I understand, for this one, and registration will be as soon as possible. But if you're interested, do make a note in your diary. And again, once the registration process is open, we will promote this event. So if you're interested in following this series of conversations, then this is like another interesting opportunity. And as I mentioned, today's recording will be put on the BSA's website. So in case of you weren't able to join from the very beginning, or would like to to recap some of the things that Michael has said, then again, once this is being made available, I will notify this via the list and the Twitter account. So again, Micah, thank you very much for joining us, and thanks so much to the audience, for asking your questions. Being here is a pleasure, and I hope to see you, or some of you, again at the 19th of February when we focus on this debate about Adorno.
Great, thank you very much.